Hello, my friends, and welcome to another episode of Stand Up. I promise you next week I'll be back on the regular schedule, getting episodes up by midnight and all kinds of other exciting things for the podcast and the stand-up community all next week. But as I told you, this month was going to be crazy, and today, is the date that I have had circled on my calendar for a long time. It is August 17th, 2023, and my daughter Ava, who's 18 years old, will drop her off at Ithaca College today. She is so excited, and that is exactly how, as a parent, you would want it to be. Looking forward to going there. It's a great school. It's a great community. It's a beautiful place in upstate New York. And when I was growing up, it was an unattainable college to even think about attending. As a matter of fact, my dad and I visited there because they had a good theater department, and they told us how much tuition was. Back then, I guess you couldn't look that thing up on the internet because there wasn't one. And my dad said, "Thanks for having us. We're going to go now." And now he's helped paying for it. So thanks, Mom and Dad, for everything. We set Ava up really well, Val and I. I think she's going to have an amazing time. Me, on the other hand, well, I'm a wreck. Yep, that's right. Crying off and on and having a hard time letting her go. But this is exactly what we designed and hoped for and set her up for. All kinds of different metaphors for birds leaving nests and soaring, etc., and so on. I won't belabor it too much more today. I'll be talking more about it, and I just want to say thanks to all of the amazing folks who listen and are part of this community, who have reached out with their advice, with their kind thoughts, with their truths. It's not easy, most of you say. It's not easy at all. Things will be different, but you're so fortunate, and most importantly, so is Ava. So thank you for all that. And now it's time to get on with today's show. I have an excellent guest joining me. I think he's one of the smartest writers out there, and he's as good at talking as he is at writing. Nicholas Grossman, who is at the University of Illinois. I love his stuff. Nick writes all kinds of stuff. He's a political science professor, but he often focuses on foreign policy issues. Wrote a whole book about drones, but today we're talking about his piece over at the Bulwark, which has gotten a tremendous amount of attention, went completely viral. It's called "The Media Still Doesn't Get Biden Voters." I think you'll love my conversation and his article, but first, just a couple of headlines, and then we'll get to Professor Grossman. Here's the news I gathered to give you on Thursday the 17th. The New York Times morning email leads with a story about the economy titled "Good, but Not Too Good." Over the past few weeks, sentiments about the economy have gone from bleak to optimistic. Inflation is down. The U.S. is still adding jobs, but not so quickly that it's prompting fears of overheating labor market. Wages are now rising faster than prices, but also not quickly enough to renew worries about inflation. In short, the economy is good, but not too good. What does it all mean for you? The chances of a job-wrecking, wage-crushing recession appear lower than they ever have in years. I would add that probably for your investment portfolio as well. So good but not too good is what the New York Times calls. In other news stories not dealing with Trump specifically, let's go to Hawaii, where they are still searching. I did not realize there were 1,000 people that remain missing. The death toll at 111, like so many other disasters. People start putting up pictures and sticky notes. It's pretty, I had no idea it was that bad. If I didn't, then maybe you didn't as well. But heart goes out to all those families in Hawaii. Can't possibly imagine that. Creates perspective for me around my sadness, saying bye to my daughter, too. I'm always kind of grateful to be able to recognize just how much worse it could be when I'm feeling kind of down, and put that in my meditation and thoughts. Well, President Biden is going to host the leaders of Japan and Korea at Camp David in an attempt to deepen the relationship and alliances in a region dominated by China. So I'm sure China is doing their best to listen in to the conversations between President Biden and leaders of Japan and South Korea. That's why they're doing it at Camp David. Probably hard to get a listening device or a spy in there. I bet you they're trying. I'm just making stuff up. All right, a federal appeals court upheld abortion pill restrictions, but access doesn't change for now. The Supreme Court's ultimately going to decide on that, which is just crazy. I got to find out who's trying to get rid of abortion pill restrictions specifically. We must stop them. North Carolina became the latest state to ban access to gender transition care. I feel like I read that headline with a different state every day. For minors, by the way, I didn't mention that detail. For minors, you can transition your gender if you're an adult. They're not trying to stop you yet. An aide to Representative George Santos, who probably will someday, impersonated an advisor to Speaker Kevin McCarthy at a fundraising emails, and he's now been charged with identity theft, which is awesome. It's awesome that they got somebody in a crime like that, because that's a terrible thing to do, and people do it to a lot less prominent people than Kevin McCarthy, but that's good. A prosecutor in Kansas, also good news, ordered the return of the materials season, a raid on a small-town newspaper, which is a story a lot of us are watching. And another story, thank you, Aaron. I didn't see this everywhere and a little frustrated by that. But wildfire is heading toward Yellowknife, Canada, which is a city, the capital city of Canada's Northwest Territories. Officials told all of the city's residents of Yellowknife to evacuate the city. About 20,000 people to leave by noon tomorrow. So that's a pretty big news story as well to pay attention to and watch. Thinking of those folks and their families. And a bat that Babe Ruth used in 1923 sold for $1.3 million for a baseball bat. So, hey, if you got it, I guess, buy a bat with it. I mean, maybe it's an investment. They're going to try to resell it for 1.5, I'm hoping, because that's too much money to buy a thing like that, is my opinion. All right. Well, it's time to get to my guest, Professor Nicholas Grossman. Before I do, remember, I can't do this daily show without your paid subscription. So please, if you haven't signed up for it, hey, think about now, at the time of August, end of August here. Great time to sign up because soon I'll be having, I think, ads back on the show. Almost positive that should be happening in September. But you get the ad-free version mailed to you in your email every day, or you just go to the website and you can listen to it there. You just have to sign up for as little as $5, but if you pay more, that'd be awesome, because this is a independent project, just me doing the whole thing, soup to nuts, every day. So if you like it, please consider a paid subscription. If you don't like Patreon or don't have a credit card, we'll work something out. Email me, standupwithpete@gmail.com. And finally, before we get to my guest, Nick Grossman, Val and I took the girls, Ava and Julia, who are now 16, almost 16, just weeks away from 16. Julia is September 27th. And Ava, who is 18 and going to college, as you know today, we went to Barbie last night. It'll always be the case. The timeline, the storyline will always be the day before Ava went to college. The four of us went and saw Barbie. Do you remember that? Yeah. Dad ate a giant bucket of popcorn almost entirely alone. But more importantly, what a movie. Yeah, it was fun. I really liked it. And there was so much hype behind it. I wasn't sure it could live up to it, but I laughed out loud several times in the theater. And so it was worth it to me. It made you think, it made you laugh, and it was a great time, a great family movie to go to. There's been a lot of hay made, a lot of criticism of it from a lot of the same types of people who always criticize depictions of strong women and their soccer teams, etc. But I'm going to ignore those because I got to enjoy it with my daughters and Val, and I thought that was a pretty special thing to be able to do the night before I went to college. So I'm in. I've seen it, and in news around that movie, it's now, I think, the highest grossing movie that Warner Brothers has ever put out, passing Batman, The Dark Knight. So that is a pretty major deal for, I think, women and equality, gender equality, and the feminist movement. I feel like it's a really important symbol and sign that that film has made so much money. It reminds me of how many people were out in the streets in January of 2017. And there's been so much momentum on these issues for women and girls for a while now in America. It doesn't always show up in policy, obviously, and we take a step back in so many states and laws around women's reproductive rights and other issues that women have been fighting for years, women and their allies, I should say. But that movie really does seem to be an important benchmark for the movement. I guess that's all I'll say about it. A lot more has been said by a lot smarter folks, but I'd love to hear from you. If you haven't seen it, go see it. It's really good. Or wait for it to come out and see it now. I mean, I don't think seeing that movie is going to change your life as an adult, but it might have a pretty good effect on any young person. So maybe do make a big deal about it and take them to the theater. All right, let's get to Nicholas Grossman. Like I said, He is one of my favorite writers, and this article that we're talking about today went absolutely viral. I saw some of my favorite, smartest people like Greg Sargent at the Washington Post and others sharing this article from the Bulwark that Nick wrote. It's titled, "The Media Still Doesn't Get Biden Voters and Barely Even Tries." And I go deep into it with Nick right after I get, of course, his reaction to Trump's latest indictment. We talked the day after yesterday, I think. Nick's the kind of guy you really want to listen to in long form, which is why I was psyched to have him back on the program. He's the senior editor of Arc Digital, and you can find their independent media covering politics, culture, and society linked in today's show notes. He's a political science professor at University of Illinois. His book is Drones and Terrorism, Asymmetrical Warfare and the Threat to Security. Follow him on X, Twitter, whatever the hell you call it, at ngrossman81. All of that, more in the show notes. Definitely read this article at the Bulwark. Let's do it right now with Professor Nicholas Grossman. Nicholas Grossman, welcome back. Thank you so much for joining me.
Hi, thanks for having me. It's great to be back.
Yeah, really important piece that I want to talk about that I think provides so much important context and commentary on this issue of the media and the election and politics. But I do have to ask you about your reaction to what happened late last night in Georgia with this fourth indictment. Nick, what do you think? Are there differences here? So many other people being indicted. I personally am really excited to see Rudy Giuliani brought up in RICO charges. What's your reaction?
I think I have a similar reaction in that this is the first one that explicitly indicts various Trump lawyers who conspired to overthrow the election, to overthrow the Constitution, really. And that is something that both I think they very much deserve, that people like John Eastman, for example, put this stuff into writing. And it especially rubbed me the wrong way, a lot of their actions, besides all the attacking America, that's something I care about, but that they did it with their expertise, kind of their authority, that the institutions that gave them a JD and the bars that said you were authorized to practice law, and that instead of doing this, like, say, I don't know, I'm a college professor. I think about my job is to educate people, not lie to them. And their job is to defend people according to the law or to prosecute cases according to the law. And what they did instead was use their expertise to try to manipulate the public and manipulate the law and make it that the whole legal system was undermined. And I don't see how a legal system can tolerate that. So I am glad to see, in a sort of serious, I'm sorry that we had to get here, but we are here. So given that we are here, I'm very glad to see that the lawyers are going to be facing charges in addition to the head of the conspiracy himself.
Not a great day for the legal profession, or a great time for the legal profession with all these lawyers being indicted. But what does it say also, Nick, about the health of our democracy or even the security of future elections? The Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger, said, as in reaction to the indictment, and I'm paraphrasing, he basically said, you can either have safe, secure, and effective elections or not.
Yeah, I think he's right that we don't know how this is going to go. So I guess it depends on how it all ends up. If the end result of this, which is still in play, is that Trump becomes president again and manages to stifle all of these different charges into him. And even the fact that this is Georgia state and the president can't formally pardon them doesn't really matter. If you think of the moment that we're in, if the president is going to put himself above the law and corrupt the law, as Trump is openly planning to do, and his supporters are openly supporting the plans to do, then the fact that it's at the state level doesn't really matter. That technically you can't pardon it doesn't really matter. So it is possible that this goes bad. But there's also a really good opportunity for democracy to show that it can handle its own problems, for American rule of law to assert itself and to set out clear rules where, hey, a bunch of you thought that you could just break a bunch of these rules and pursue power. And as long as you had enough fans and as long as you lied about it enough in the media, that nobody was going to do anything about it. Seeing that proven wrong would be great. It would be a really good precedent, both for the country and I'd say for the world.
Very well said. As always, here on the podcast, you're great at talking about these things. And of course, at your Substack, which I hope everybody subscribes to. It's one of you're one of the smartest thinkers out there. I've thought that for a long time, since I started reading your work a couple of years ago, Nick. And I'm psyched to talk to you about this piece, which I think is so important for so many reasons. The media still doesn't get Biden voters and barely even tries. The least important question I just kind of want to ask you about this piece is,
Where does this rank in some of your other pieces? I'm seeing a lot of people reference your work on this piece specifically. Is this a hot one?
I think so. So this is for the Bulwark as opposed to for Arc Digital. So I don't see the behind the scenes stats on it. So I can't give you an exact number. But based on the reaction, yeah, I think this is probably one of the most read things and talked about things
Great.
I've written.
Why do you think that is?
Because it touched a nerve. I mean, it's not always a topic. It's not like I've, say, built up a big audience about this topic specifically, but because it's one of those things where a lot of people have noticed it and they haven't seen it articulated anywhere in public. So I am far from the only person who has noticed the media predilection for these, say, Rust Belt diner safaris, or, going to Ohio and talking to Trump supporters and what amounts to going up to them and saying more or less like, oh, are you a Trump supporter? Yes. And do you support Trump? Yes. Why? Well, the same reasons as I always have. Okay. And then they just do it over and over and over again. And they don't make any similar effort to cover a whole bunch of other voters in the country. And I think that all those voters and people reading it have noticed.
Yeah, I gotcha. So let's get into it. I'm going to read just the opening paragraph. Conservative and mainstream media don't agree on much, but one point of consensus is that everyone should work harder to understand Trump supporters. The implicit message, you don't have to agree with the populist right, but you should be listening to, empathizing with, and engaging them more. And then you go on to just say, a common style of this coverage is the safari to Trump country, in which journalists from various outlets, most of whom live in big metropolitan areas, go to a rural community or Rust Belt town and talk to Trump voters, often white, working-class men, in diners. The resulting articles are often tautological, basically Trump supporters support Trump, and framed as if explaining to liberals who might think that Trump's failures will cause some voters to abandon him, that they won't. And then you go on to cite these examples and frame it for us, including, you mentioned David Brooks' column in the New York Times, which a lot of people are talking about, Matt Yglesias writing at his Substack. Give me the specific examples. Lay it out for us, Nick.
So with the Iglesias example was that about a guy who was recently outed as a racist, who was also, I'd say, pretty openly racist, named Richard Hanania. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, but I've only read it. But where the Iglesias had recommended some writing by him and got a lot of criticism for it because this is a guy who says, quite openly about how, like, to have law and order, we need to be cracking down harder on black people. But I don't think white people have the stomach for it. That really, is a recent example of his public, not even a pseudonymous commentary. And so when Iglesias got criticism for this, his response was that, like, yeah, I acknowledge that he's racist, but it's important to read conservatives. And Brooks' article that a lot of people are talking about was something that is sort of another one in the economic anxiety Trump voter genre, in which he argues that their Trump support is a natural kind of inevitable reaction of working class people to elite mistakes, and to, in particular, elites kind of creating a class structure that benefits them and hurts all the workers. And that doesn't really resemble reality. It is off just about who he's talking about. And this combination of the two things, I agree with Iglesias that people should read conservatives. If you want to have an idea of what are major ideas that are influential today, if you are, say, liberal, progressive, et cetera, that to, if anything, challenge your own arguments. So I think that in general, but also I don't go around telling people to read any conservative just because they're a conservative. Right. And I also noticed that there isn't really a parallel of this, that there's nothing in conservative media or even mainstream media that says, hey, conservatives, you really need to be reading liberals more. And you really need to be going to, say, like, I don't know, some black church outside of Atlanta, and you got to talk to people and you have to listen. Look, you don't have to agree, but you really should be spending more time talking to these people. Look, they just won an election. They are a major driving force in who the president is, and you miss that. And that part is almost entirely absent from the national discourse. And it's that asymmetry that really jumped out to me and that I was criticizing and trying to shed some light on.
Why we could talk for a long time about that asymmetry in terms of citing examples, media outlets, specific people, the way things are framed, the headlines, the choices editorially that they make. But how pervasive has that been? Or more specifically, why do you think that happens? My feeling, real quick, and I have no data behind this, is because it's what sells. It's the same reason conservative media has been so powerful for so long. The style, the fear-mongering, the binary, all of it, the conspiracy, it sells, it gets more clicks, it gets more money. So whether you're the outlets that we might be talking about, the kind of mainstream corporate media outlets, NBC, CNN, the New York Times, why do they maybe go out to those diners, frame those articles and issues the way they do? Why do you think that they do it?
So I think you're probably right about conservative media in terms of what sells, that the people who are consuming that, who choose to, are not really interested in hearing about how liberals, progressives, Democrats see themselves, or not being interested in being told to understand more. That's not why they turn to conservative media in the first place. So that part, I think there's a decent business argument to it. With mainstream media, just in general, yes, that they're businesses, and that's the probably principal driving factor, and then other things also factored in. But a lot of that seems to be driven by themselves, by the people at the top of it, of things like the New York Times or the Washington Post. There's no evidence, as far as I know, that these Trump diner safaris, especially after you've already done a bunch of them, are blockbuster articles that tons of people read and find so fascinating. That's why they're subscribing to the New York Times, because they need their 12th diner safari and wouldn't be happy without it. That more of it seems to be, at least my best sense of it, is a almost personal reaction to the people at the top of these news organizations and some of the reporters to the 2016 election, that they in many ways didn't see it coming, and that they are somewhat sensitive to the criticism that they have a liberal and or establishment bias.
For sure. Somewhat sensitive. I think they're very sensitive about that. And I've, it's a hacky thing to say, but the truth has a liberal bias. But the truth has a bias. It's to the truth. And I feel like that sensitivity should be filtered through a more objective truth. Sorry.
Sure. Just as a broad thing about media, I would also like to see them do truth over balance. So the idea of balance is you take two things and you just treat them as equal, no matter whether they are or not. And truth is, if the facts say that they're unequal, you tell people that they're not equal and present them as such. And I think that a lot of mainstream media leans towards, establishment media, whatever you want to call it, legacy media, does the balance variety, that they think that they have to have Republicans, Democrats equal and opposite as basically all times, or they're being biased. And what they do as a result of that is they are distorting things. That is a bias. And as things in particular, as the Republican Party has become more and more distant from truth and has, in fact, I'd say flat out rejected it as a value, opposed it as a value under Trump, that then it makes things even more distorted. But also then there's the working the refs problem, in which the probably more of the liberal audience wants them to try to adhere to facts, and more of the conservative audience, at least the one that, say, still reads or comments on and critiques things like the New York Times or NBC, don't want them to do that. They want them to go for balance, or, what about what this Democrat did? Or, Hunter Biden is the equivalent of Donald Trump, and Hunter Biden is the equivalent of Jared Kushner, and of Ivanka Trump, and also, of Clarence Thomas. We can balance that out with Hunter Biden too. Even though he doesn't hold the power or have the influence, to say he's done some shady things and they've done some shady things. And if you don't want to be biased, you have to say that one of each side has done shady things. And that, I don't know whether that helps business or not, or whether it's a personal ethos. I don't totally know, but I think it's apparent that that's how they effectively operate.
It's a perfect example. The whole Hunter Biden thing is a counterbalance for every single scandal that we're seeing of Trump and Republicans in general. And it's my thing about that, real quick, is, by the way, if you think let's concede everything that you think Hunter Biden did, he did. Let's say that that's all true. If you believe that and that was wrong, then should the same thing happen to someone on your team? And often in polling, they're like, no, not if my guy did it. No. And that's the thing that I can't get past and get over. But let me ask you about the most important part, I think, of this piece at the Bulwark that we're talking about, and which is the first part of it. You kind of diagnose, obviously, the problem with media and why they still don't get Biden voters. And the second part of it, you use data to explain the Biden coalition, which pretty much lays out the case as to why a lot of folks in media are getting it wrong because they're not doing what you're doing, which is looking at the Biden coalition. Go ahead.
Yeah, looking at the actual voters of because I think it is good to look at Trump voters. I think the basic idea of people like, say, New York Times editors were underrating that as a political force. We're right to say, okay, we clearly missed something and we should put more energy into covering it. And they also in the beginning at least, extended this a bit to Bernie Sanders voters that, maybe they missed that somewhat. They thought that Hillary was going to have an easier time in the 2016 primary than she did. Okay, maybe they missed something and they should pay more attention to it. And yet, somehow, not only, of course, the fact that Hillary got more votes than Trump did, so there's some political force there, but by overdetermining the 2016 election, of treating it as this like big national referendum in which the nation overwhelmingly went for Trump, as opposed to a very narrow election in which he won when just about everything broke perfectly for him. That doesn't take away from the fact that it's a win, but it does mean it's narrow. And then in 2020, they kind of got the Biden Democratic primary wrong in that the prevailing narrative was the Democrats are obsessed with identity politics. They are practically socialists now. And so they're either going for Bernie Sanders or for somebody who's going to really do the, kind of woke thing. And they didn't at all. That Democrats overwhelmingly went for the old white guy old white Christian guy who goes to church and sometimes puts his foot in his mouth and is, more moderate on policy than just about everybody else who was running. So they kind of missed that one. And then the one that they really missed, that they badly missed, is 2022, was the midterms. Of that, there was all this press coverage of, and it's in op-ed pages, and it's from conservatives, from centrists, and also just as straight news articles about a red wave. And then even some where red wave wasn't enough, and they said red tsunami, here it comes. And the opposite happened. The Democrats had the strongest midterm for president's party since George W. Bush right after 9/11. And so they just completely missed that. And yet even still haven't said, okay, so maybe we missed some of these voters and maybe we've been getting it wrong and maybe we need to talk to more of them. Like, hey, there in fact are millions of Biden working class voters and millions of Democratic working class voters. So maybe working class people don't just kind of hate the elites and then want to give them a middle finger with Trump. And they didn't ask themselves any of that. Or another really bad one was a lot of times going into the election, and I cite a number of these comments in the piece, but were these supposedly, savvy politics knowers saying things like, oh, abortion doesn't matter. People aren't really going to vote on that. You know what people really care about? Gas prices. They really care about gas prices. And Democrats are making such a mistake. Oh, it's being really risky that they're talking about abortion. And everything that we've seen since then, the 2022 midterms, referenda in Kansas, a recent referendum in Ohio, a whole number of polls show that Democrats, and really not just Democrats, a majority of Americans really do care about abortion rights and really do think that things like forcing a 10-year-old to go across state lines or filing criminal charges against a 19-year-old and her mother or creating a lot of legal difficulties to treat things like ectopic pregnancies. A lot of people are really appalled by that.
What a shocking.
They didn't seem to register it or care.
Shocking. It's just shocking. Professor Eric Siegel has told me for years, apparently, back in the 70s when Roe v. Wade was overturned, a lot of conservative Republican women were part of that. Or rather when Roe v. Wade was decided, and that they were pro-choice, and that Republican women remember what it was like, to not be able to have access to abortion and so many other things. But it's just crazy that they continue to get that issue so wrong when, half of the gender, overwhelmingly at least, is pro-choice. But you break it down. You say the Biden coalition, over 81 million Americans voted for Joe Biden. The vast majority sure aren't societal elites. They struggle with rising costs of housing, healthcare, groceries, college, etc., economic disruptions from globalization, technological change. They might be hurt more by the decline of shopping malls than the decline of coal mining. But both impose economic difficulties on the larger community. By every reasonable definition, you write, of working and middle class, the Biden coalition has tons of them. And then you break it down by income, by education level, by type of work, by location. And you talk about what Trumpists and their apologists just don't get, that millions and millions of Americans are for all kinds of things that President Biden not only represents, but arguably has accomplished. Take it from there.
Well, one thing I find so odd about it, and this one, I called them Bidenists, but I was uneasy with the term because a lot of the people that you're talking about and who voted for Joe Biden, I think would likely do so again, are not all that into him. Or meaning they don't really have, say, strong feelings about him. Some of them are quite critical of him. And obviously some people really like him too, but it's not a cult of personality in a way that, say, Donald Trump and also Barack Obama, in a different way, but also were. And so that part on its own is remarkable. And it seems to be something that these elites, by which I mean people who are rich or who have a job like New York Times editor or Supreme Court justice, not things like, a middle school teacher who went to college, that just an example of where Brooks, for example, used college degree and elite as interchangeable. And they're about 38%, I think it was, of Americans over 25 have a college degree.
Crazy.
And a whole lot of them went to state schools and are, struggling with various types of things in their life. And somebody who, is a millionaire but didn't go to college has life that is probably easier. I mean, at least say has a better claim to being an elite that,
right.
Helps if you can hire and fire people as opposed to being subjected to being hired or fired. And the scramble on it of who they're actually talking about is in so many ways off. And with the Biden coalition, that these are voters that they don't, meaning media, don't cover much, but who definitely are not in any logical sense of the word, certainly not the way they see themselves, as elites.
Right.
And so the story of elites drove all the working class to Trump doesn't make sense. I mean, one great example of this, Biden won voters that make less than $50,000 a year. Trump won voters that make more than $100,000 a year. And depending on the measure, the middle 50 to 100, either Biden won or it was about tied. Depending on kind of who was counting it. But so to say that the working class president is the guy who won people who make six figures or more, and the elites are the ones who make less than $100,000 a year, maybe even less than $50,000. Those are the real elites. That just sort of has it scrambled and backwards. And I think maybe part of the error was that I got a reaction to my article about, why don't these reporters go to Biden country, and talk to people? And I saw somebody kind of snidely dismiss it as because they live in Biden country. And, I thought about it, I've lived in New York, I've lived in Washington, D.C. And if you think that those, especially you, highly educated reporter at the New York Times or wherever, think that that is what all of Biden's coalition is like, you're just badly missing it. And there are some people who are obviously New York City, Washington, D.C. on the whole definitely voted a lot more for Biden than for Trump. But there's a whole lot of America, way more of America is not in those cities or like those cities than is in them. And so they are missing and don't seem to really care about what you could call just the average American Biden voter.
There's more than enough information and statistics to inform journalists doing these kind of political coverage to get it right, I feel. There's no excuse to get it wrong at this point. You lay it out so succinctly and specifically in this piece about what Biden supporters care about. And it's real things that affect real people, quote, real Americans, which I hate that phrase. But so often the right uses it to describe, people who support their agenda. Well, way more. I
tried to reclaim that one.
You did. I saw that.
Yeah, with real Americans, because it's something that, both I feel strongly about, and I think a lot of other people do. And the idea of, if you're an American, then you're a real American, that there really isn't anything else to it. And in fact, that one of the things about America that I really like, that of where I'd make a case for American exceptionalism is the fact that anybody can be an American, or a line I really like, can't take credit for, but how immigrants who come here, every other country, there are people who are, you'd say a citizen of the country in part maybe tied to ethnicity or tied to religion or something like that. Whereas with America, what America is doing is finding the people who are already American around the world and inviting them in, as opposed
really
to.
Well, yeah, I love that.
I really like that line. So
your line, though, the piece, part of the piece that you use is you say Bidenists think all U.S. citizens are real Americans, no matter where they or their parents were born, no whether they live in a city, suburb, or rural community. And that just about does it in terms of describing it. But it's also really accurate about what Biden supporters, about what we generally believe, about who is American. I don't really get caught up in it myself, but I don't know. I always think, by the way, a perspective is what makes you a citizen, a better citizen. So if you have a perspective having lived in or being born in another country, that's going to make you, quote, more American. But that's argument's not much of a winner, Nick.
Yeah, in all different types, where, in a way it makes you more American, and in a way somebody who can trace their ancestry back to, I don't know, the Mayflower or whatever makes them more American, or somebody who can trace their ancestry back to slaves makes them more American, or all of it, whoever you came in. I mean, for me, it's back to Ellis Island, which I'm sure is one that tons of Americans can say. Yeah. But I think that with the rural community part also is a really good highlight of the asymmetry, because there's Biden in general has overseen the Democrats in Congress, but also bipartisan and Republicans in Congress too, but have funneled a lot of money to rural America. And that money is generated primarily in cities. And overall, I think Bidenists, and in this logic, I definitely include myself, are fine with that. If anything, I think it's good. I mean, their great example is healthcare. Like the idea that because somebody lives on a farm, they should be an hour and a half away from a, MRI machine. No, absolutely not. The federal government should help them out, and they should be 15 minutes away from an MRI machine. Or
better example than the MRI, forgive me, Nick, is broadband. Like you may or may not need an MRI. You definitely need internet, and it's not cost effective to spend money dragging power lines and broadband out to one or three houses, one might argue, except for the part where that's exactly what we should be doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's what I think a big purpose of government is.
Yes.
And so when you see that, I'm trying to imagine the inverse. So with Republicans, you think the way that Republicans talk about people in cities. If Democrats who live in cities talked about people from, a rural area in the Midwest, for example, in that way, it would be a major story across conservative media and how awful it was. And probably a lot of mainstream media would pick it up also, that how condescending and how rude. And the way that you'll often hear people talk about, somebody in the inner cities and which also has a racial element to it also. But with condescending dismissal, and that this is another case where there isn't equal and opposite on both sides. It is not at all true that Bidenists are disdainful of, say, rural people, that they, in many cases, want to see it as we're all in this together. And any place where if they need help and somebody else has resources, well, great, then we can use some of those resources to help. And that it doesn't balance out in that kind of balance over truth way.
Well, I think the one point that you made, and maybe probably in this article, you only have just so many words, but I mean, to me, the one that you talked about, what Bidenists support is, well, you wrote, Bidenists include civil servants you've never heard of who don't get any attention or much pay, but keep all levels of government running. These civil servants actually meant their oath of office rather than seeing it as words disingenuously mouthed to get power, and really are loyal to the Constitution over any party or politician. I guess I would just add to that, or even argue that Bidenists on Earth One, these terminology I often use, Earth One and Earth Two, but Bidenists are generally people across the political spectrum, but that believe in a certain role of government, function of government, what government should be responsible for, and that you can't not have a local, state, or federal government. And we believe in its role and purpose versus the Bannon and right-wing ideology of deconstructing. I say Bannon now because he's updated what conservatives from Reagan to Limbaugh have professed for years about government is the problem. I feel like those are kind of the two separate ideas, too, that we believe in government. We know it's broken. We know it's slow. We know it's corrupt. We know there are all kinds of problems, but we don't have a better idea. We don't think schools should be privatized, prisons should be privatized, et cetera, and so on, about the role of government. That's what Bidenists and Earth One citizens generally agree upon. Yes? No? Nuance?
Sort of. And I think that is the maybe older school conservatism, which there's still definitely some of it around, especially when you mentioned privatizing schools, for example, both some business interests and, some individuals who are activists for that. But a lot of the thing that has been striking about the Republican Party now is, in some ways, they are very into big government, have gotten very statist. So when it comes to, for example, dealing with immigrants, especially illegal immigration, then get extremely statist. There you see with Ron DeSantis, probably the best example of this, of where a company is criticizing you something that you're saying, well, crack down on them and crack down on them hard and kind of use state power to prosecute culture war. Or you can see this with organizations like CPAC, the Conservative Political Action Committee, doing a conference in Budapest in Hungary, and then inviting the leader of Hungary, Viktor Orban, to be a keynote speaker at one year. I think it was in Dallas. And that is an open, at this point, I'd say maybe not dominant, but certainly a very strong philosophy within the right now is to use the state to prosecute culture war. And that the people, the Reaganites or others who said, Barry Goldwater of the small government types, are wusses or are just unaware of the stakes. That, the viewpoint on this is like the woke revolution is taking over every institution and the state must come and crack down hard on them. And that first part of the premise is pretty nuts. It is insane. I don't mean that there's no influence for people like that, but the idea that trans teenager is the person who is really in charge of everything, as opposed to the, oil executives and Supreme Court justices and president and, other really wealthy people. And I name all the actual, power in society is pretty nuts. But driving that as philosophy, they have talked themselves up into needing to use state power to crack down on it. And so they can be very statist in that regard. And so the government, I'm the government, I'm the problem, or, I messed it up. But that Reagan line, the worst things are that I'm the government, I'm here to help. That there's some of that left, but a lot of it has reversed. But
you're saying what you're saying, though, Nick, is that they would still say government's the problem. But the truth is, in the way that they govern, that they love government as long as it's doing what they want it to do. But they're still saying that it's the problem. Then when they get in power, they use it however they want.
And the one that where the term I would use for the civil servants in many cases that you see with the denouncing now is the deep state. Oh, I just went, the quotes went off camera here. Deep state. Yeah. And where in a lot of this case, and this is what you see with the Trump indictments too, of by deep state in many cases, they mean kind of rule of law or, the idea that so either the state of Georgia or the United States Congress passed the law and, president, whoever signed it, it's become duly law of the land. And now you want to hold somebody like Donald Trump to it. Well, that's, totally unfair. And that's just, these people are unelected. And it's, well, they are unelected. But I mean, maybe not some DAs, prosecutors, but things like, say, various civil servants or even people in the intelligence community and the military and the FBI. A lot of them are unelected, but their jobs were created by elected officials and the people that oversee them are appointed by elected officials. And there are various ways that the people and the people that they vote in to represent them have oversight and control over this and have budgetary power over it. But there are also those laws that were created for, in many cases, I think, good reason. And the way that you've seen a lot of Republicans turn on the FBI and call the FBI a liberal of all places. The FBI stocked with liberals. If you know any federal agents or know anything about them, really, that one's just laughable.
So true. Or, anybody in law enforcement, generally speaking, the FBI counts. Listen, Nick, Professor, so good. What a great article. Always a great conversation along with it. I really appreciate your time, and I'm psyched that you're out there, and we'll continue to promote your work, and hopefully people sign up to support your Substack, read you wherever you're writing, and I really appreciate you joining me so everybody could listen to your views. This is such an important issue in peace. Thank you.
Thank you, Pete. You are like the best host and podcaster and person that I've ever met in my life. Okay, sorry. I somehow cut off the ending of him saying thank you. I don't know where it went. I'm sure he said thank you, but I decided to replace it myself. Okay, well, that's it. Nicholas Grossman. Go check him out. Everything Nick Grossman is in the show notes for today's podcast. If you don't look at the show notes, please do. There's a lot of links in there, and I'd love to have you following me in all my social media. Go check it out. Scroll down to that or the Patreon email. If you're not opening the paid subscriber email, check that out every once in a while. Every day there's a vitamin N photo from another listener like you submitted. Maybe you could have your nature photo used. The only rules are there can't be any man-made objects in it at all. I know there was the tip of a kayak in Mandy Hansen's picture from the other day, but, you know, it was from Idaho. I had to include it. It was such a beautiful picture. I should have cropped it out. So sorry about the rules. Mandy, thank you for that. Send in all of your vitamin N, your thoughts, and everything else to standupwithpete@gmail.com. And I'm going to need those thoughts today because today is the day. I am driving Ava up. We are to college. All right, that's it. Tomorrow, though, I do have a great conversation with Peter Bergen of CNN, who's been covering national security, terrorism, foreign policy issues for many years, and actually interviewed bin Laden a whole bunch of years ago, the first television crew to do that. He's got a new podcast. I had a really good conversation with Peter Bergen, and I will post that for tomorrow, and I will talk to you when I talk to you because I love you and I need you and I appreciate you, and I'm very happy to be here along and with and for you as well. And now, John Carroll, sing us out as always, and go buy this song if you haven't already. Pay the $3.99 right now. JohnCarroll.org.
They had to stand up. They had to stand up. They had a keen imagination for a crystal ball, drawing all the plans of stand up. But all they had to go on was the time they were in, with other causes for laws, and since they weren't even sin, they knew that change was gonna come before the change could begin. They had to stand up. All right, they had to stand up. We got to stand up. We got to look the devil square in the eye. We gotta let him know it's his time to go and make it clear when all we hear is a lie. Why you lying awake wondering where the money all went? It'll be the cost of freedom that'll go unspent. You can see him flee the scene of that experiment if you stand up. All right, we got to speak up. We got to reach up and raise your voice in every way you know how. Don't be toes up, you got to show up. Ain't no better time to do it but now. No need to pledge allegiance to no wanton tribe. Rise up and show obedience to the voice inside. And listen well and it'll tell you not to run and hide. It says stand up.